It is 7 o'clock. We're going to get started with our Wednesday wind down with Dan and friends. This is a webinar and YouTube show for frustrated outdoors people. I like to get together with my friends and drink beer. It's challenging to do that right now, so I'm going remote. So I'm Dan Conger. I'm the host. Tonight, actually, sorry to disappoint you all, I'm drinking plain water, so I got to rehydrate. And with us is Doug. Doug, would you introduce yourself?
I'm Doug Grover, and tonight I'm drinking a Paulaner Oktoberfest.
Ooh, nice.
I just read that the first time since World War II, they're canceling Oktoberfest in Munich.
Right. Wow.
That's a lot of beer people are going to have to drink at home instead.
Yes. So tonight we're going to be talking about the Grand Canyon, but as Doug and I started talking about how to plan this conversation, the show, realized that probably less of a travel log and more of a how-to or things to consider if you're going to be hiking the Grand Canyon, and that's definitely where we're going with this tonight. So I'm just going to actually just turn it right over to Doug. So if you want to jump right in, Doug, please, you could share your screen and show us what you've got.
Sure. Just as an intro, I've been hiking the Grand Canyon average 2 times a year for the last 11 years. This will be, I think, year 12.
That's a few years out on the trail, and I don't even get out that often. Well, that actually shows that's really good that you get out at least twice a year for a week-long trip. That's good dedication. Good on you.
So this is going to be a discussion of kind of considerations for hiking in the Grand Canyon. I'm going to assume that people have real experience with other kinds of backpacks in other areas, like in the Sierra. So the question will be, what extra information should I know if I want to plan a backpack in the Grand Canyon? So I've got a handful of considerations here. The first one is, when do I want to hike in the canyon? And in order to answer that, you really have to answer the question, what kind of temperature do I want to hike in, and what kind of weather do I want to experience when I'm there? So the Grand Canyon, as opposed to the Sierra, is shoulder season weather. So during the middle of the summer, the temperature, as indicated by the thermometer at the Bright Angel Campground at the river, was over 130 degrees in the sun last week. In the shade, it was probably 114 degrees. That's a little unusual. Normally, it doesn't get quite that hot in June, maybe 105 degrees in June. But that's so hot that shoes were delaminating, and they actually had one fatality last week associated with the heat. So what I do is I hike in the shoulder season. Nice. That would be March, April, May in the spring, or October in the fall. Now, this is a picture actually taken at the beginning of November several years ago. In the spring, the weather can be a little iffy in terms of rain. It tends not to rain solidly for any long period of time, but you can have an occasional shower. And it will be windy in the spring, whereas in the fall, there's probably less chance of rain. There's more chance of it being colder. So by the time you get to the middle of November, it'll be below freezing at night in the inner canyon up at 4,000 feet, which is where I typically camp at.
So I think you almost answered my question I was developing. Is you gave 3 months in the spring, but only 1 month realistically in the fall. Is that really about the temps, the potentially freezing temps?
My general experience is that the beginning of October still can be quite hot. I was actually on a trip 1 year with a gentleman who, it took me a while to figure out that his vacation schedule was actually planned 13 months in advance. So when at 5 months in advance, I was trying to get him to hike half a month later so that we'd be hiking at the end of October instead of the middle of October, I finally realized, wait a minute, this calendar was set long ago.
Right.
And we got on the hike and it was very hot. It was over 100 degrees at the river in the middle of October. Now that's unusual for October. The spring tends to be better. So in general, my advice is hiking in March and April. By May, it starts to get warm, but there are a lot of people who like hiking in the Grand Canyon in May.
Okay.
The next consideration is, what kind of trail do I want to hike on? How many miles do I want to hike a day? What kind of condition of the trail am I looking for? And in the Grand Canyon, the park rangers tend to dissuade folks from trying to hike more than 10 miles in a day. So I've made a number of trips in the Sierra. I've made a lot of trips in the Grand Canyon. And per mile, the trips in the Grand Canyon just seem harder. I'm not sure why, but you know, the Grand Canyon's like an inverted mountain. The first day in is steep downhill. The last day out is steep uphill. That's kind of the opposite of the Sierra.
Right.
But there are some trails that are easier and some trails that are harder. So the trail that's shown here is the Upper South Kaibab Trail, where you have to navigate occasional mule trains hauling either provisions or people. And the trail's pretty smooth. Occasionally there are water bars, but the trail's nice and wide, easy to hike on. When you get farther away from the corridor trails, the trail gets more rocky and more difficult to navigate. So this is a part of the Tonto Trail, probably 2 miles east of or west, I should say, of the trail that heads down to Phantom Ranch. And this part of the trail is not a trail. It's scrambles straight up this hillside.
Good, because I was going to say that looks like cross-country travel in Anza-Borrego, but because I'm not seeing a trail on that one.
Well, there are cairns. That's what classifies as a trail here.
So a route is a trail. Okay.
Next consideration is exposure. So one of the big deals with the Grand Canyon is you're going to get a lot of sun. Most of the hiking that people do is in the corridor trails, where a lot of that is inside of canyons, and so there are big chunks of that where you'll have some kind of shade. After that, there's the Tonto Trail, which follows a large platform at about 3,000 feet below the rim, and that is on the south side of the canyon. So when the sun is lower on the horizon, you have a lot more opportunities for shade. The trail that's shown here is the trail into Clear Creek, which is on the north side of the river. And by the time you reach this Tonto platform, hiking the next 7 miles, there's probably 2 spots of shade, which are huge rocks that are just next to the trail. So once you're on that chunk of the trail, there's no hiding from the sun.
Now, have you found that umbrellas have been helpful at the canyon, or I know in some terrain that they don't quite make sense? You know, like a Go Light or other type of umbrella, sun umbrella.
For trips that I make into the Grand Canyon, when I know the weather is going to be warm, I will carry my Go Light umbrella. When I know the temperature's not going to be that hot, I don't worry about it, unless I think there's a chance of rain, in which case I will take it. But
it looks like it's generally wider, and you're not going to be, if you're going through, like if you're doing bushwhacking and stuff, an umbrella doesn't make sense. But generally, it looks pretty wide, except for a few. Even on this section of trail, it's plenty wide.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the photograph here, in terms of exposure, now let's say in terms of terrain, there's a large drop off on the left side of this trail that's carved right into the canyon wall. So you certainly wouldn't want to fall off that. This isn't, in fact, the best example of exposure in the canyon, but it's one that shows up quite well in pictures. So this particular hike, I actually was hiking with my umbrella, and this was, I think, 10 years ago. I decided to hike the North Rim Trail down to Phantom Ranch and back, spending one night at the river. And I got down to about this level. I had to break out my umbrella. The temperature was already over 100 degrees. And I continued to hike about another 3 miles. The umbrella was awesome, but I blame it because I eventually realized, even with the umbrella, it was too hot. If I'd only hiked with a hat, I would have turned around at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, with the terrain component, are there ever places where people that are afraid of heights have issues with that, with falling exposure as opposed to sun exposure?
There are, and this particular location isn't one of them, simply because the trail is quite wide where it's carved into this. But there are trails on the south side of the canyon where there is tremendous exposure, where if you happen to stumble and fall off in the direction of the canyon, you better self-arrest within, the lip of the canyon might be 5 feet, might be 10 feet away. And if you don't arrest before you hit that edge, it's somewhere between 200 and 500 feet straight down.
My palms are sweating as you speak of that. Don't.
I've got a friend of mine who's been on probably 8 of these trips so far. And on the very first trip, in the middle of the trip, when we got to one of those really scary spots, he said, this isn't the time I should tell you I'm scared. I'm scared of exposure. And he's been inoculated across all of those trips now.
True. Nice.
The next issue is water. So you have to deal with water on all backpack trips everywhere. The Grand Canyon's in the desert, so you need to consider how you're going to get water in the desert. There are, I think, 4 main sources of water in the canyon. The Colorado River at the bottom of the canyon is running all the time. And there are a number of creeks that come out of springs that wind their way down to the canyon, and the trail on the Tonto Trail on the south side crosses many of those creeks. Probably half of them are perennial and half of them dry up during the summer and there's no water. And so you always need to make sure that even if there's a creek on the map, you better be sure that that creek is actually flowing, or that you have enough water with you to wait until you get to the next creek. Another source of water is what you see here, which is potholes. So on this particular trip, I've been here like 4 or 5 times. Normally these potholes are empty. And in the week prior to this trip, it rained and filled up these potholes. So we lugged a whole bunch of water in there, but it was great to have extra water from these potholes.
Right. So you didn't have to ration it. You could be a little more judicious with it. So nice.
So let's just say we did sponge baths that we would not normally have been able to do.
Yes, I would. When you pack in your own water, there are no sponge baths. That does not happen. So you mentioned the creeks that might be dry. What is there a source of beta of information on water sources? Like there is one for the PCT, and that's about it. But the water report. But how would you know?
There isn't for the Grand Canyon. The best source of information for water and a lot of other conditions, like is there a damage to the trail, would be the backcountry office for the Grand Canyon. And their source of information in terms of water is recent reports. So people, including some of the rangers, will occasionally go out and check and provide water information. My general experience is that has been not as successful as I would have liked.
Okay.
But if you look online, there'll be a lot of reports of people who make trips, and it's pretty clear which of the little creeks are perennial and which ones dry up.
Okay. Nice. So this is a good reminder. We're almost at the halfway point. So if you have any questions for Doug, just throw them in the Q&A and we'll catch them at the end. Onward.
So continuing with water, one of the challenges with getting water out of the Colorado River is normally it's very clear. You can pump right out of it or filter right out of it, except when it's rained upstream, or except when, as in this case, they've let an additional amount of water out of Glen Canyon upstream. So this is a high water event which occurs about every November, and the volume of water in the Grand Canyon increases by a factor of 5. So when this happens, you got to get rid of the mud. So you can try to have a large reservoir like a bucket and let the water sit overnight, or the trick I use is to use alum as a flocculant to try to get the suspended dirt particles to coalesce. And it'll within an hour or 2 with appropriate alum, you can pump the water.
So I'm going to imagine that no amount of back flushing is going to clear a filter that's been clogged with that.
I think in conditions like this is equivalent to trying to get water out of a glacially silt suspended stream in the high mountains.
Mm-hmm.
It basically, if you don't take care of it, you're going to wreck your filter.
Right. Okay.
Next consideration would be food protection. So this picture shows chainmail bags, which are designed to protect your food primarily from mice. And there are a lot of mice in the Grand Canyon because there are a lot of people that leave food residue everywhere.
Okay.
So the two other animals that you need to worry about protecting your food from are ringtails, it's a possum that kind of looks like a cat, very small cat with a huge bushy tail. And my favorite, ravens.
Oh boy.
So
okay.
when you have your chainmail bag like rat sack, you can just leave that on a rock in the middle of the night, because the nocturnal animals, they try to bite through it and they can't bite through chainmail. But a raven can easily peck through that chainmail bag. So that's why in the previous picture you saw that was in the middle of the day, and those bags were suspended in air so that the bird can't get leverage as it tries to peck the bag.
So it would be like the equivalent of trying to hit a punching bag with a hammer and it just moving around, put it on the flat in the ground against a rock, and they're just going to beat right through it.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
The other thing ravens will do is they're scavengers, and even if it isn't food, they like stealing things. I was on one trip where my group pulled into a campsite, and a gentleman indicated that there were ravens that were on the other opposite canyon wall about 30 feet away that would steal things and could open up the zippers on your backpack. As he was describing this, a raven swooped down, stood behind him, and was opening up zippers on his pack, like 6 inches away from his leg.
Man, it's not the robots that are going to overthrow us. It's the ravens.
Yes. Next consideration is permits. I'm not going to spend much time talking about them here. You need to get them from the National Park Service, and their website's a really good source of information. General advice is request your permit the maximum amount of time for early consideration out, which is 4 months in advance on the first of the month, and provide lots of opportunities for different arrival dates or different series of campsites you want to do. Unlike the Sierra, the Grand Canyon is individually permitted on each night. So your permit has designated spaces for you to be every single night on your permit.
So when you first talked about length of trip, when we were talking about this earlier in the week, and you said something about the 10 miles, they discourage that. And I'm like, how would they know how far we're going to do it? This is how they're going to know it, right? If I have to go from this point to that point, they can say, you're trying to do 15 miles, bad idea. But if it's 10 miles or under, okay, that's really interesting. Now, are you camping at designated camp spots, or are you saying I'm going to camp at this junction? What kind of definition are they looking for a overnight location?
The Grand Canyon is divided into use areas, and the most popular use areas have designated camp locations. And the rest of them, you can camp anywhere within that use area that you want. Although typically people camp in the use area where the water is flowing.
Yeah.
Another issue is trailhead transport. So from many of the South Rim trails, you can't drive your car there. You have to take a shuttle bus to get to that location. And the shuttle buses go to a number of the trailheads on the South Rim. If you go further on the east up the South Rim, there are places where you can park your car. For many of the trips that I do point to point. I don't do a loop. So there's an available taxi service in the Grand Canyon that I can leave my car at the main South Rim facility and use the taxi to drive to a remote trailhead and then hike back to the central location.
I want to address just the picture that you have here. This almost looks like the Laguna Mountains in San Diego, right? It's kind of grassland. There's some pines or some conifers. And the first time I saw that, I was really paying attention to the landscape at the Grand Canyon, I realized that there's a lot of this, right? You're so used to the iconic South Rim Village view and look, and it wasn't until you start spending a little bit more time you realize there is a lot of this terrain.
Well, this is on the North Rim at another 1,000 feet higher.
Right.
And this is one of the roads on the North Rim that goes to one of the remote trailheads there.
Nice.
And maybe the last consideration here is you need to have an emergency plan. Just like with any backpack trip, things can happen and you need to be prepared. And especially in the Grand Canyon, the Park Service does a lot of rescues every year because of two things. One of which is people don't really appreciate the heat that they're putting themselves into. And secondly, they don't understand that unlike hiking in the mountains where you can hike until you're tired and then you can hike downhill, here you need more energy to hike back uphill at the end. So people exhaust themselves and then they can't hike back up.
Right. Right.
And if in the worst case scenario, there is help. They do a lot of helicopter rescues of people. But in order for them to do that, they have to know they need to come look for you. So on most of my trips, I don't bring anything like an inReach because I'm hiking with a group of like 5 or 6 people. There have been a couple of trips where we've gone into very remote areas, and so I've taken not just an inReach, I've actually taken a sat phone just to make sure that if somebody runs into trouble, I can have a real-time conversation with the emergency services.
Right, right. Okay. Well, if you folks have some questions for Doug, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A. Here's one question for you: Is this sounds a lot like the tips that you've given us and the information you give us sound like it's like most desert travel. So for the most part, would you say that these apply to all desert travel, not just the Grand Canyon?
A lot of this would apply to desert travel. Some of it is unique to the Grand Canyon, but again, I think a lot of the people who run into trouble in the Grand Canyon isn't necessarily because it's the Grand Canyon. It's because it's a desert and people aren't familiar with hiking in the desert.
Right. That's one that's being that I've grown up in Southern California and that's where all of my hiking my hiking career has been. It was always striking to me when at the PCT kickoff they would have a class on desert travel. I'm like, well, doesn't everybody know? Like, no, because people are coming from other states that don't have deserts and don't have those dry climates. And there's some very unique things about desert travel. The other thing I had was that I've never backpacked at the Grand Canyon. I've day hiked it. I've done a rim to rim twice now. I went north to south and then south to north. Not necessarily back to back years. Like gave a little break in between them. But how many of these things are do you think really apply to backpack, and some of them aren't going to apply to day hike, or there's going to be some that are going to be very specific to backpack? Would you agree?
Yeah, and it really depends on where you're at. So for the rim to rim hikes, those are very heavily traveled corridors. And so it would be extraordinarily unusual for you to run into some kind of problem on one of those corridor trails and not have somebody, encounter you within a couple hours, whether it be another hiker or a ranger. Once you get more remote, it's a different circumstance, and you need to be prepared to be totally self-reliant.
So on some of those non-corridor trails, is it possible to go a good section of your trip without seeing people?
Yeah, so there was a trip I did years ago at a place called Royal Arch. Awesome hike where you have a 20-foot rappel as part of the hike. And that was the one trip where I took the sat phone because I assumed that we would not encounter anybody that week. And it turns out we encountered 11 people on a guided Sierra Club trip. And those are the only people we saw was in
all
that
in
group.
one group. Okay, yeah. Nice. Okay, we got a question from Kelly. Food protection, simply keep it within the backpack, or do you need some sort of odor-proof container?
My general advice is don't worry about odor-proof. Use the chainmail bags, and when you get into camp, you unpack your bag and pull all the food out of your bag and just shove it in the chainmail bag. And when you leave your pack in camp, general advice, and this is true not just in the Grand Canyon, leave it open so the critters can go inside and realize there's no food inside.
As opposed to chewing a hole through your $300 backpack.
There was one trip I made, a solo trip, where I suspended my chainmail bag in a small tree, and in the middle of the night I heard some rustling, and I turned on my headlamp and saw 3 mice on the top of my mesh tent, and I then moved my light over to the chainmail bag, and it was coated. I probably had 3 dozen mice on the outside of that chainmail bag.
Wow.
They were all extremely frustrated because they couldn't get anything.
Right. So it's not quite it's different, right? Because a bear might smell it and want to chew on it, still not get the food rewards. Okay, I can appreciate the scale. Although mice in your food could end your trip really quick, or make a really hungry walk out if you're multiple days in.
Well, I also had one trip where on the very last night of the trip, I left a water bucket out, and in the morning there were 3 dead mice in the bucket, and I wasn't going to worry about trying to sterilize that bucket. I could take that home, but that would have been very unpleasant if that had happened in the middle of the trip. and I never left water in a bucket overnight after that experience.
Okay, good times. Good times. Well, we're just about out of time. It gives me, let me just double check, make sure there were nothing that popped up in the chat. So I think we got it. Okay, I think we got your questions. So what, as a reminder, I will have this recording up with our other recordings on YouTube sometime tomorrow morning. Next week, I'm going to be talking about off-trail travel. Off-trail travel, Doug kind of alluded to some of it. It was not necessary. Maybe it was more route finding. Off-trail travel involves a lot of route finding, some good mapping and compass skills, but it opens up lots of options. But then there's some cautions, some things that you need to be aware of that you can get into that the map doesn't always show you. So you kind of need to be able to read the terrain as to what's going on. So that's what we're talking about next week. Doug, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. It was fun.
Good deal. So and by the way, if you have ideas that you want to see on other shows, you can tell me personally, put them in the YouTube comments, or shoot me an email. Most people that are watching live know me. So thanks all. Thanks you. I appreciate you coming. Doug, have a great evening. Thank you.
You too. Good night.
Good night.